Alibe kahle. Yebo, kubi kakhulu.
In the dusty township of Soweto, where the smell of burning coal mingles with the sweet aroma of pap cooking over open flames, there lived a young woman named Nomsa, whose very presence could make strangers weep without knowing why. The elders whispered that she carried the weight of unborn ancestors in her eyes, but what they didn't know was far more extraordinary and dangerous. Nomsa possessed what the Western doctors would call a rare personality disorder, but what her grandmother, Gogo Thembi, recognized as something far older, the ability to absorb the emotional pain of others until it became her own. In Zulu they called it ukufila ngenhlizio zabanye, living through the hearts of others. Every morning as the sun painted the corrugated iron roofs gold, and the distant sound of taxi horns echoed across the settlement, Nomsa would sit outside her family's four-room house, plaiting her sister's hair with fingers that trembled, not from cold, but from carrying the sorrows of everyone who had looked into her eyes the day before. The weight of her neighbor's grief over a lost job, the ache of the street children's hunger, the fury of mothers whose sons had not returned from the mines. All of it lived inside her chest, like a colony of restless spirits. Sawubona, Nomsa, the children would call as they ran to school, their worn shoes kicking up red dust. But they never lingered. Something in her gaze made them uncomfortable, as if she could see through their laughter to the bruises hidden beneath their school uniforms, the empty stomachs disguised by bright smiles. Her mother, Mam Thembu, worked double shifts at the clinic in Alexandra, mopping floors and sterilizing instruments, always rushing past Nomsa, with worry creased between her eyebrows. "That child sees too much," she would mutter to anyone who would listen. "It's not natural for someone so young to carry such heaviness." But Gogo Thembi, ancient as the baobab trees that dotted the high veld, understood. She would sit with Nomsa in the evenings, the air thick with the smoke of wood fires and the distant hum of the city, sharing stories that had been passed down through generations like precious beads on a string. "Long ago, child, our ancestors chose certain souls to be the keepers of collective pain," Gogo Thembi would say, her weathered hands working strips of biltong as she spoke. They were the ones who would take the suffering of the community into themselves, like lightning rods drawing down the storm. But every gift from the ancestors comes with a price. The trouble began on the day of the community meeting about the new mine that threatened to displace half the township. Nomsa had tried to stay away, knowing that large gatherings of emotional people left her bedridden for days afterward. But her mother insisted. This concerned their family's future. The meeting was held in the old church hall, its walls painted the color of dried mealy leaves, windows thrown open to let in the October heat that shimmered like water over the township. 200 people packed into a space meant for half that number, their bodies pressed together, emotions running high as representatives from the mining company spoke in careful English about relocation opportunities and fair compensation. Nomsa sat in the back, her hands clenched in her lap, trying to build walls around her mind the way Gogo Thembi had taught her. But as anger and fear began to fill the room like floodwater, those walls crumbled. She felt Mr. Dlamini's rage over losing the land his grandfather had died defending. She absorbed Mrs. Ancomo's terror about where they would find another home, the despair of young mothers, the helplessness of old men, the fury of teenagers who saw their future being decided without their voices. All of it poured into Nomsa until she could barely breathe. Then something unprecedented happened. As the mining representative, a pale man in an expensive suit who looked like he had never touched red earth with his bare hands, continued his presentation, Nomsa began to speak, not with her own voice, but with the voices of every person in that room. "You come here with your papers and your promises," she said, standing slowly, her voice carrying the weight of generations. "But you don't see us. You see obstacles to be moved, not people with roots that go deeper than your machines can dig." The room fell silent. Even the children stopped their fidgeting. Nomsa's voice had changed. It carried the timbre of old men who had worked the mines, the melody of women who had sung freedom songs in the face of apartheid's guns, the rhythm of teenagers who spoke truth to power in languages the corporate world couldn't understand. "This land holds the bones of our ancestors," she continued, and now people were turning in their seats to stare at her, some with fear, others with recognition. "You cannot compensate people for their ghosts. You cannot relocate the dreams of the dead." The mining representative shuffled his papers, suddenly looking very small in his expensive suit. "Miss, we understand your concerns, but the economic benefits—" "Whose economics?" Nomsa interrupted, and now her voice carried the sharp edge of every domestic worker who had cleaned houses in Santon while her own children went hungry. "Whose benefits? You speak of numbers on paper while we speak of families torn apart, of children who will grow up without the stories that only this soil can tell them." What happened next had never occurred before in all the years Nomsa had lived with her condition. Instead of absorbing the emotions of the crowd, she began to reflect them back, amplified and clarified like light through a prism. The people in the hall suddenly felt their own emotions with startling clarity, not dulled by exhaustion or daily survival, but pure and undeniable. The silence stretched like a held breath. Then Mrs. Nkomo stood up, tears streaming down her cheeks. "She's right," she said simply. "We've been so busy trying to survive that we forgot we have the right to live." One by one, others began to stand. Mr. Delaminy, his weathered hands shaking not with age, but with conviction. The teenagers from the informal settlement, their voices joining in languages that painted pictures the English words could never capture. Even the mining representative found himself affected, his carefully rehearsed words dissolving as he truly saw, for the first time, the faces of the people his company would displace. But the emotional intensity was taking its toll on Nomsa. Blood began to trickle from her nose as the collective feelings of 200 people flowed through her like electricity through wire too thin to carry the current. Her vision blurred, and she felt herself splitting apart, her own identity dissolving in the ocean of shared human experience. Gogo Thembi, who had been watching from the doorway, pushed through the crowd with surprising strength for someone her age. She reached Nomsa just as the young woman began to collapse, catching her in arms that smelled of herbs and wood smoke and generations of wisdom. "Enough," the old woman said, her voice cutting through the emotional storm like a blade. "The gift has been given. Now let her rest." As Gogo Thembi half-carried, half-dragged Nomsa from the hall, the young woman's senses went haywire. She could taste the metallic fear on the mining representative's tongue, smell the sweet-sour scent of hope mixed with desperation that clung to the crowd like perfume. The touch of her grandmother's hands felt like cool water on burning skin, and the sound of voices raised in discussion behind them seemed to come from underwater. They walked through the township as the sun set, painting everything in shades of amber and rust. The familiar sights, children playing soccer with a ball made of plastic bags, women hanging washing on lines strung between shacks, the smoke rising from 100 cooking fires, all seemed to pulse with new meaning, as if Nomsa was seeing not just what was, but what could be. Her grandmother's house sat at the edge of the settlement, surrounded by a small garden where traditional herbs grew, alongside hardy vegetables. The scent of impefo filled the air, its sacred smoke carrying prayers upward to ancestors who had never forgotten their children below. Inside, dried gourds and clay pots lined the walls, each one holding remedies passed down through bloodlines that stretched back to times before colonizers drew their arbitrary borders across the continent. Gogo Thembi laid Nomsa on a reed mat and began to prepare tea from leaves she had grown and dried herself. The bitter taste of the medicine anchored Nomsa back in her own body, reminding her where she ended and others began. "Tell me what you felt," her grandmother said, settling her old bones onto a low stool carved by Nomsa's great-grandfather. "Everything," Nomsa whispered, her voice hoarse from speaking truths that weren't entirely her own. "I felt everything they felt, but clearer, like I was translating pain into something they could understand and use." Gogo Thembi nodded slowly. "The ancestors have been preparing you for this moment since the day you drew your first breath. But child, this gift, it's not meant to be carried alone." Over the following weeks, word of what happened at the meeting spread through the townships like wildfire in the dry season. People began coming to Nomsa, not seeking healing in the traditional sense, but something rarer, the ability to truly feel and understand their own emotions without the numbing layer of survival that poverty and oppression had taught them to wear. A mother came whose son had been killed in taxi violence, her grief so buried under rage that she couldn't cry. After sitting with Nomsa for an hour, she finally sobbed for the first time in 3 years. A young man came who had been hiding his love for another man behind a mask of aggressive masculinity. In Nomsa's presence, he finally felt safe enough to acknowledge who he really was. Elderly people came carrying guilt from the apartheid years, both those who had collaborated to survive and those who felt they hadn't resisted enough. But each encounter took its toll. Nomsa grew thinner, her eyes larger and more haunted. She began to experience episodes where she would forget who she was, lost in a maze of borrowed emotions and inherited pain. Sometimes she would speak in the voices of people who had died decades before she was born, their unfinished business flowing through her like water through a broken dam. The mining company, meanwhile, had postponed their plans indefinitely. The community meeting had sparked something they hadn't anticipated, a unity born not from anger alone, but from a deep understanding of what they stood to lose. Organizers were traveling to other threatened communities, sharing not just strategies for resistance, but something more valuable, the experience of feeling their own power clearly and without shame. But Nomsa was disappearing, dissolving into the collective consciousness she had helped awaken. She would sit for hours staring at nothing, her breathing shallow, her pulse barely perceptible. Gogo Thembi watched her granddaughter fading and knew that the time for half measures had passed. Do you remember the first time you truly felt someone else's pain as your own? How did it change you? In your community, who are the ones who carry the collective weight? And what happens when they can no longer bear it alone? What would you sacrifice to help others understand their own hearts? And when does the price become too high? On the night of the new moon, when the township lay in darkness, broken only by scattered fires and the distant glow of the city, Gogo Thembi led Nomsa to a place that existed only in the stories, a clearing where the ancestors had once danced, where the boundary between the living and the dead grew thin as mist. "Every generation," the old woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The ancestors choose someone to carry the gift, but the gift was never meant to destroy the carrier." It was meant to teach the community to carry themselves. Around them, the air began to shimmer. Nomsa felt rather than saw the presence of those who had come before. Generations of women who had carried similar burdens, who had served as emotional lightning rods for their people. Their voices joined in a song that had no words, but spoke directly to the spirit. The disorder that the doctors see, Gogo Thembi continued. It's not a sickness, it's an evolution. But evolution only works if the species learns to adapt together. As the night deepened, Nomsa understood. Her gift had never been meant as a permanent solution, but as a catalyst, a way to show people what they were capable of feeling and understanding when they stopped hiding from their own hearts. She had been a mirror, reflecting back their capacity for empathy, their ability to truly see one another. The ritual that followed had no name in any language, because it had never been needed before. Under the guidance of ancestral wisdom that flowed through Gogo Thembi's weathered hands, Nomsa slowly released the accumulated pain she had been carrying, not into emptiness, but into the earth itself, where it could transform into something nourishing. As dawn broke over Soweto, painting the sky in shades of hope and possibility, Nomsa opened her eyes and saw clearly for the first time in years. The constant weight of other people's emotions had lifted, but she hadn't lost her gift entirely. Instead, it had transformed into something sustainable, the ability to help others connect with their own emotional truth without drowning in it. The mining company never returned to Soweto. The community had learned to feel its own power too clearly, to be moved by promises and threats. Other townships began to ask for help with their own struggles, not seeking someone to carry their pain, but someone who could help them understand their own strength. And Nomsa? She became something the modern world had no name for, but the ancestors had always known. A healer of the heart's disconnection from itself, a teacher of emotional truth, a bridge between what people thought they felt and what they actually carried. But late at night, when the township settled into sleep and the ancestors whispered their ancient songs on the wind, questions lingered in the air like smoke. Was her disorder really rare, or just rarely recognized? In a world that teaches us to numb our pain and hide our truth, how many others carry similar gifts without understanding? And what would happen if more people learned to feel not just their own hearts, but the hearts of their community, not as a burden to be carried alone, but as a strength to be shared? The story ends, but the questions remain, floating on the night air above Soweto, waiting for the next generation to discover their own rare and beautiful ways of being human in a world that desperately needs healing.